Hi, Mark. Tell us a bit about yourself. What's your life in a nutshell?
Hi, Quang. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. My name's Mark. I was born in Saigon in 1972, and I was separated from my family during the war, and then I was adopted by an American family in 1975. I grew up in Western New York, and then went to Harvard, and then got my first job at Goldman Sachs. And I've been in financial services for the past 30 years. We're recording here from Singapore. I'm excited to be here in the same city that you are.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think it's a very interesting sort of life background. Overseas Vietnamese, the members that we have sort of fall broadly into two buckets. One is people born and raised in Vietnam and then they went abroad. And then there's people more like me who sort of were overseas born and raised. So your case is a bit more special, I would say, as a Vietnamese adoptee. And so could you tell us a bit more about your early life and upbringing and how it shaped who you are today and how it shaped your life journey?
Of course, I grew up in a place where I didn't know other Vietnamese people until I was college age. So I grew up in a, mostly white suburban American community. I didn't think a lot about being Vietnamese until I was a teenager. And it was an interesting time in America in the 1980s because America was still getting its own psychological, American psyche around what Vietnam and the Vietnam War meant for Americans. And so a lot of the Hollywood movies produced at the time that I was a teenager, were all about Americans in Vietnam. And actually, none of those movies are about Vietnam or Vietnamese people. They're really just about Americans. And I didn't really understand what that meant until later in life. So I feel like my first real introduction to Vietnamese people and all of that was during my college years. We had there were probably at the time a pretty active Harvard Vietnamese Association. There were probably 40 or 50 students involved, and I would say there were a mix of students in terms of their Vietnameseness, where
Mhm.
there were people who were more like me on the spectrum who used American English names and only spoke English and didn't know any Vietnamese, and there were students who mainly grew up in Vietnam and came to the United States later, maybe like junior high or high school age, used Vietnamese names. English was clearly their second language, and definitely identified more as Vietnamese than American. So it was a really good mix of students, and one where, because I hadn't been surrounded by Vietnamese family and friends, I was very lucky to have that community who was very welcoming to me. My introduction to the Vietnamese community and introduction to Vietnamese food. I tried to learn some Vietnamese, which I've never been that successful in doing. So my Vietnamese is very bad. And the United States hadn't reestablished political or economic ties with the United States at that time. So I didn't have the opportunity to visit. But when I was in college, there was a special visa program for educational exchange. So I was able to go to Vietnam in 1993.
93. How old were you then?
I was 21 years old, 21 years old. And the one university in Vietnam that accepted foreign students was the University of Hanoi. And so I was able to study there and live in Hanoi and travel all around the country for 5, 6 months in 1993, which was an amazing time. That's also the time when, I did all of my photography about Vietnam at that time, which then eventually, many years later turned into a book.
Awesome. And sort of what kind of style were you brought up and how did that shape your reality about being Vietnamese and your education as well? Because you sort of went on to have a very successful career. Where do you think this sort of comes from?
So I would say that I did not have a strong Vietnamese identity growing up. I clearly knew in my body that I looked different than my parents, and I was received as an Asian person in my community. But I think, again, until I met other Asian people, other Vietnamese people, and really, through relationships, through education, through, reading books, did I kind of psychologically, emotionally identify myself as Vietnamese. And I think that's been a lifelong, multi-decade journey. I also think getting married and having kids, what is an important part of that too, because my kids who are biracial, they understandably want to know about themselves and the Vietnamese part of themselves, and where does that come from and what does that mean? And so I wound up as a parent needing to articulate and explain things that I might not have forced myself to otherwise. And that's, that was an important, part of my growing experience as well. But I would say, growing up, I didn't think a lot about it because, I wasn't raised in a Vietnamese family with a Vietnamese culture. And then when I met other Vietnamese people, I had a little bit of, imposter syndrome. Am I really Vietnamese? And, I don't feel very Vietnamase. Or, sometimes even some Vietnamese people would say like, oh, you're not very Vietnamese. And I think it was, I've had the chance to meet the author Viet Thanh Nguyen. And, one of the things that he says, because he's a year older than I am. So he also came to the United States when he was about 3 and grew up here. And even though he was in a Vietnamese family, in a Vietnamese, community in San Jose, he also was told by a lot of elders, oh, you're not very Vietnamese. And it was refreshing to hear him say that, because I think where he got to in a way that made sense to him, he was able to push back into the people who would say to him, you're not very Vietnamese, about, who are these gatekeepers of Vietnameseness? Who gets to decide who's Vietnamese and who's not Vietnamese? That was refreshing to hear. That I didn't have to justify to anyone or have some qualifications or meet some qualifications to be Vietnamese, and that I just am, and that's okay. And even if I have a very different experience than other people in terms of how I grew up or my family story or my lack of traditional credentials, I still qualify.
Let's talk a bit about your career journey. What sort of made you, or what motivated you to go to Harvard and then pursue finance specifically? Do you remember there was a specific reason or a specific motivation? Yeah.
I went to Harvard without a very clear idea about what I wanted to do professionally. I started off as a pre-med. I thought about being a doctor. Midway through college, I realized I didn't really have the conviction to see that all the way through. And I also, thought about, did I want to start working or did I want to go to graduate school? Because, obviously, that's a fork in the road. And I decided at that point that I wanted at either to end school or take a break from school. I wanted to do something else. I also, like you, I was involved with a girl who I liked a lot and proposed to her my senior year. And so I also was motivated to get a job and start earning some money. And so without specificity, I started applying to all sorts of different jobs. And at Harvard at the time, that included investment banks in finance, consulting firms, tech firms at that time, like Microsoft, brand management firms like Procter & Gamble. Those were all the types of firms that interviewed on campus. And I interviewed with anyone who would give me an interview, and including, firms that didn't want to give me an interview. I just persisted until I was able to get an interview, because I didn't really have a pre-professional background in terms of lots of internships and those types of things. I did a lot of very pedestrian things like lawn mowing and babysitting, and nothing that screamed pre-professional. But through the process of interviewing, I learned a lot about the companies, the various companies. I met a lot of people at those companies and asked them a lot of questions about what they did and what they liked and what they didn't like. And I really liked the finance people. And those were also the firms where I was extended offers. And I was fortunate enough to get an offer from Goldman Sachs. And that's where I wound up starting my career in a 2-year analyst program, and I wound up staying for 11 years through various different roles, and that was really a fantastic place to start my career. I started in their international business in 1994 when Goldman Sachs was still expanding internationally. Goldman had expanded into Europe in the 1980s, and then started expanding to Asia in the 1990s. So when I joined, the firm was still going through that expansion. It was still a private partnership. So it was a much smaller firm than it is today. It was a really fantastic place for me to start my career. I was interested in, seeing the world. I had visited New York, but I had never been there. And Goldman Sachs gave me the opportunity to see a lot and spend a lot of time in New York and London and Hong Kong and Tokyo and Singapore, and see the world in a different way than I had previously, and in a different way than you do when you're a tourist.
So what was that experience like for you at Goldman in the beginning, especially? How did it shape you as a professional?
Goldman Sachs was a great place for me personally to start my career. It was my first real job. I had one suit, which was my interview suit. So it was a great learning experience for me, from everything from, how do you dress and how do you act and how do you talk to clients and how do you present yourself in meetings. In many ways, it was a whole different educational experience and all the things that you don't learn in a classroom, and more like a professional apprenticeship where you work, for me, and that was the environment, then, where you get to work really, really closely, elbow to elbow on a trading floor with lots of other people who are at various stages in their careers. Some of, people who are peers, some are a few years older, some are 10, 20 years more experienced than you are. And for me, it was a very nurturing environment. And I developed a lot of mentorship relationships with, people who are further along in their careers, who took me under their wings and spent a lot of time, teaching me everything that I needed to know about, all the hard stuff in terms of finance and numbers and quantitative skills and analytical skills, but all the soft stuff too, in terms of, how to conduct yourself in a, high-end finance professional environment.
What were some of the biggest challenges you had back then?
I think there were a number. One is I did not study anything related to finance before joining Goldman, and they have a track record, to their credit, of recruiting, who they view as just, smart, ambitious people that you can learn everything on the job. But certainly, I peers of mine definitely knew a ton more before they joined than I did. So my learning curve was very steep. And fortunately, again, there were a lot of people who had a lot of time for me to answer all my dumb questions to help me get up that learning curve. And then I think, on the softer stuff, it was definitely intimidating. I'd never been in an environment like that. I remember asking my, bosses, really basic things about how to dress and how to, what should I say in meetings or what should I not say in meetings? And, some of those questions were explicitly asked out loud, but a lot of it was just absorbing through observation. What are other people doing, and copy what they're doing.
You said you had a great time there, and it was a very good choice for you. Would you say now, looking back a few decades, for someone younger who graduated, is this still a career path that you would recommend now in 2024?
So I would say it depends. I think I find finance fascinating. Not everyone does. Certainly the tech sector, outside of Microsoft, they're really, there were no, Google didn't exist. And certainly the tech sector overall is a much bigger, draw for talent than it was back then. I also think there are more opportunities for people who are more entrepreneurial today than there were then. So I think that, if anything, the funnel is, the options are greater today than then. But I do think that in terms of working at a big institution, learning the basics of, kind of the foundational, basics of a career. Working in a big company like, Goldman Sachs definitely has its benefits. It's certainly credentializing, for your resume and those types of things. But now that I've had experience working at big companies and small companies, there are pros and cons to, to big companies as well. But for me, it was in many ways the ideal place for me to start because, again, it was a big company, but I wound up working in a small business within that company. So I was given a lot of responsibility very early on. I had a lot of great mentors who taught me all about the business. I did achieve one of my goals of, wanting to see the world and, traveling all around, which was, fantastic and eye-opening to me. Further down the road for the next 20 years after I left Goldman, because of the Goldman Sachs alumni network, I wound up working with many of those people that I met at Goldman Sachs in my first 10 years of my career in my subsequent jobs. And, even now, 30 years later, I'm still working with a lot of those same people just because the longer you stay in any industry, including finance in New York, the longer you are around in it, the smaller it becomes. And 30 years in, I know a lot of people and a lot of people know me. And that's definitely beneficial to getting things done.
Awesome. Can you walk us through what happened then after Goldman for you? How did that journey look like?
I had been at Goldman for 11 years, and I got to a place, having worked several different jobs with several different people, I got to a place where I decided that I wanted to try something else. Mm. And I set my sights on eventually wanting to move to the buy side because I had covered a lot of buy side clients, money managers, hedge funds, etc. They were my clients. I had a good understanding of what they did, and I thought what they did was very, very interesting. But I didn't have any specific investment experience, and so I wasn't a natural hire on that side either. So it took me a couple of years to get to where I wanted to go. And I got there because one of the people that I worked with at Goldman Sachs wound up starting his own hedge fund. And because he knew me and a number of the people at that hedge fund, Eaton Park, were all from Goldman Sachs, and they knew me, then they wanted to hire me. So I wound up going there, and I stayed there for almost 9 years until the founder turned the hedge fund into a family office and gave all of the LP money back. And so then I needed to figure out what I was going to do next. And I was planning to go to another hedge fund when I got in touch with another ex-Goldman Sachs colleague who was at that time CEO of an insurance company that had also spun out of Goldman Sachs. And he recruited me to join the insurance company, which was called the Goldman Sachs Reinsurance Group, which was then rebranded as Global Atlantic, and was early in this reformation of what's going on in the overall insurance industry. And that wound up being a fantastic place, to be as well. And we wound up growing, the assets from a relatively low base to over $100 billion when I left. And we sold the company to KKR. And so that was, also a fantastic experience. And then, most recently, I was a client of BlackRock. And after the sale to KKR, then BlackRock recruited me to join their insurance business. And that's where I've been the past 2 years. That's
a very long and deep career. I think a lot of deep expertise across banking, finance, and insurance now.
30 years and less hair and more gray hair.
Yes. What would you say? How have your career goals and priorities evolved over time? And so what has driven those changes?
When I was at Goldman, one of my mentors told me something which stuck in my head, and I still find relevant. Mm-hmm. Is that when you think about your career, there are really three forms of compensation. There's the professional compensation in terms of what you're actually doing and what you're learning, how you're growing professionally. Two, there's an emotional compensation, which is do you really like the people that you're working with? And do you have strong relationships with those people? And then 3, there's, of course, financial compensation. For people to be really happy in their jobs, at least 2 of those 3 things need to be working. Ideally, all 3, but sometimes you can't get all 3 right. But typically, if you're just in the job for just only one of those things is working, you're generally unhappy with your role, and you're thinking about doing something different. So when I think about managing my own career over time, I really think about maximizing all 3 of those things. I think how people evaluate those 3 things is different by individual. But for myself, as you pointed out, I've gone through banking, hedge fund, insurance, and now asset management. I've never done the same job twice, which I think, if I think about myself as an 18, 19-year-old, I could have done 10 different majors at college and been happy in all of them, because I think I'm a genuinely intellectually curious person. So I also think, like, if I joined Google, I'm sure I could find lots of interesting things that I would love to do there and learn there as well. So I think for me, finance has been great because it's a really, really broad umbrella, and there are a lot of different parts to finance, and I've been fortunate to work in 4 of the 4 different parts of it. And throughout that 30-year career, I've learned a lot of different things along the way. That's number 1. And then number 2, I probably index higher to number 2, emotional compensation, than some other people. But who I work with and really, really liking who I work with is very, very important to me. I wind up spending lots and lots of time with the people that I work with. And if I'm not enjoying working with them, it's not worth it to me. I really need to like and have some emotional connectivity to the people I work with, my clients, all of that. And then 3rd, financial compensation, of course, is, important. And managing that is important, to be proactive in managing that, over time as well.
When you say it's really important for you, the emotional part and who you work with, what sort of traits and characteristics do you look for? Also, when you, for instance, interview people?
The acronym that we used at Eaton Park, which I like, are SWANs. The people I like to work with are SWANs. When I'm recruiting people, I like to find SWANs, and it stands for S is smart, W is hardworking, A is ambitious, and N is nice. So when I'm building teams, thinking about working for a new manager, those are really the traits that I identify with.
Love that. Swans. And, if you think back, what is one or what are some of the most important lessons you learned throughout your career, I think?
Oh, lots of lessons.
And I added, it's a very long career, so it's a hard question to answer, but if you could think of some.
I did write, after I worked at Goldman Sachs for 2 years, one of my managers asked me to write lessons and advice for new analysts. And I wrote down a 1-pager of 100 lessons I learned as a financial analyst, which 28 years later, I hear is still given to new analysts at Goldman Sachs. And I think it's traveled to other companies by now. And so some of the things are dated because technology has changed. But overall, the spirit of that advice is still true. But in terms of like specific lessons, I think, one, and I've touched on, a few of these things already. One is to be really, really genuinely intellectually curious about what you do and becoming an expert in that. I think a lot of people only kind of scratch the surface of their topic area and don't necessarily ask all of the like how and why and what does that mean and how does A connect to B and how does that connect to C. And I think that even now at this level, where I am now, where I talk, mainly to, chief executive officers and chief financial officers and chief investment officers and very, very senior people, the reason why I think I've been successful, with in my different roles, talking to very senior people is that I bring that level of interest, enthusiasm to my work. And I think hopefully that rubs off on others, and people see that and see that demonstrated in my day-to-day level of enthusiasm in what I'm doing, and that drives insights into what's happening in the markets, the industry, more broadly. And I don't pretend to know things that I don't know, which just drives more questions when people talk about something that is a new topic to me. Then I'll ask them lots of questions about that so that I can learn from them and hopefully learn new things.
Okay, the next question is maybe a bit vague. Let's try. I'm very curious about when you say now that you operate at this level. I'm asking sort of myself, what is like really required to perform and operate at this level? What has been, the insight for you when you sort of entered that arena, sort of entered that league that you have observed in terms of what it takes to be at this level and compete at this level?
So one of the things, you asked me about, Goldman Sachs early on. And, I said for me, it was a great training ground. And part of the reason why it was a great training ground for me is in terms of organizational structure, it was a very flat structure, meaning that there was a managing director who ran my group and everyone essentially reported to the managing director. And at very early stages in, my career, because we were doing financings for companies, I got a lot of everyday exposure to CEOs and CFOs. And I could hear in terms of capital markets and raising capital and doing investor relations call, I could hear them over a very broad range of industries, hear them and how did they talk about their companies? How did they talk about business, the world? How did they handle both everyday Q&A as well as challenging Q&A? Because there's always, hard things going on. And how do you handle those questions? So I think by being in the room definitely helps. And then two, being a keen observer and listener helps. And then over time, through various, experiences, through all of the various, jobs I've had, becoming a trusted lieutenant, trusted partner to very senior people, became more of an apprenticeship over a multi-year, multi-decade period of time, in terms of being comfortable in those environments and having confidence that you know what you're talking about and that you have something to bring to the table. And then I think over time, it just becomes more natural that you get invited into more rooms and more conversations because, people say, oh, you should talk to Mark because he really knows a lot about that topic.
Confidence is a very big topic amongst OBs, I feel. Was this something you always sort of had at a level where you were mostly confident going into those rooms, or was it something you sort of had to overcome more for yourself?
No, I think it definitely, it definitely was not there day one. It definitely, has developed over time. But I think if you, become, I talked about intellectual curiosity before, when you become a subject matter expert, and when you start out in your career, that might be in a very narrow subset or specialty of exactly what you're doing. But over time, that broadens out. That's where the confidence, comes from. And then forcing yourself, whether it's just with colleagues or with clients externally, forcing yourself to have to communicate, whether it's in writing, in written word, in Q&A, whether it's writing a memo or writing a presentation, being able to communicate clearly ideas that are floating around in your head is definitely a learned skill over time. At least it was learned for me. It did not come naturally to me.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing, Mark. I think last topic to wrap this up, I think let's move a bit away from career. And I think one very interesting aspect about you is also sort of your journey with your Vietnamese identity and sort of that. You said you went to Vietnam for a few months, and you started at college age, at least connecting or exploring that. From then on, how did it move on for you in, sort of exploring that side of yourself?
Yeah, I think over time, it's important. It's been important to me since college as an adult to cultivate friendships with Vietnamese people in my community, and then more broadly. There have not been that many Vietnamese people in the financial community. There are some, but not that many, and there are more as time goes on. And then I reconnected with family in Vietnam after many decades, and have had the opportunity to meet them in person, and that's been really important and meaningful to me as well, because I didn't even know that I had family in Vietnam, or I didn't have any conception that I would ever meet them. So
how did you do that? Like, how did you reconnect? What was that process like?
So that's a very long story, but the short version is my sister was working for an American family, and she told them that, oh, I had a brother who was adopted, and the American family helped track me down, and they, reached out to me. And I confess that when they first reached out to me, I was really shocked and really didn't know how to process that, because I have the challenge of what I call asymmetry of memory, meaning that I left Vietnam when I was 2.5 years old. And so all of my family in Vietnam remember me, but I don't remember them. And then there's a multi-decade cultural language gap, as well as life experience gap, because their life in Vietnam after the war, in the decades since, was obviously a very, very different experience than, my life in America. But I think the wonderful thing is that we have been able to meet each other. You can't make up for decades of lost time, but for me, it was, and I think for them too, it was meaningful to reconnect. I feel like every Vietnamese person of this generation has some like terrible and dramatic family story, but I think that's part of the Vietnamese experience of the past century.
And then from then on, did you visit Vietnam more often and had those family encounters more often?
Yeah, so when I saw you in Vietnam, I was in Vietnam last year, and then I think my aspiration is to be in Vietnam at least once a year, and we'll see if I can keep up with that aspiration. But being in Vietnam makes me happy. So I've been able to take some of my kids there. I would like to take the other kids there too.
Love that. Yeah, they will love it as well. It's a very fun place for kids as well.
Yes.
Cool, Mark. Thanks so much. What's sort of next for you? Any upcoming projects or goals you're excited about?
Nothing specific. It's been fun to go back to Vietnam recently. My current work does not include anything with Vietnam. At some point in the future, I would love to integrate my work in some way with Vietnam, given all of the super exciting economic activity, happening in the country. So figuring out how to weave those things together at some point in the future would be great.
Yes. Let's definitely stay in touch on that. Okay. Final one. How can our members connect with you or follow your work? You also mentioned photography. Feel free to mention it as well.
No. So, I'm always, I've met with the Overseas Vietnamese folks in New York. And I think it's a nice mix of some of the communities that you mentioned at the beginning. I think there's a group of overseas Vietnamese who were born and grew up in the United States, and now we have like a different wave of Vietnamese who grew up in Vietnam and maybe did university in Vietnam, or maybe came to the United States for university or graduate school, and now are starting careers in New York. That's a good mix too. So it's been fun to meet those folks and see where they are in terms of starting off in New York.
Yes, thanks. And how can our members connect with you and follow your work?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. So if there's anyone who wants to reach out, they're more than welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Very interesting conversation. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Great. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you.
That's it for today. If you enjoyed this, you will love the OV community. Learn more at overseasvietnamese.com.